Okay, hi everybody. It's just about 12:30, so we're going to get started now. I'm Kristen Body. I'm the Membership and Events Manager at the Asheville Art Museum. I want to welcome you all and thank you for being here and taking some time out of your day to join us for these programs. Today's program is being led by Assistant Curator Whitney Richardson and Curatorial Fellow Sarah Kelly. And I know they're really excited to speak with you today about craft and tourism in Asheville. But before I turn this over to them, I just want to go over some housekeeping. So first, microphones are muted and video is turned off by default when you logged in. You should note that we are recording today's program, so if you prefer not to be recorded, make sure that your audio and video remain off, and you can check that by seeing the microphone and video logos at the bottom left of the screen. They should have a red line going right through them to indicate that they're off. And this recording will be shared in tomorrow's e-blast. And so next, you do have two options for asking questions or making comments. The first is to type your question or comment into the chat box, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. And I encourage you to enter your questions as we go. That will keep the program moving along and prevent any lulls in the presentation. The second option is to use the raise hand button, which you'll find also at the bottom of your screen by clicking on the participants button. And when there's time, I will call on anyone with a raised hand, unmute your audio, and then you can ask your question directly to Whitney and Sarah. And finally, if there's anything you feel we can do to improve these Zoom programs and our format within Zoom, please let us know. I'll send out a program evaluation when this event concludes, so you could share your feedback that way, or you can feel free to email me directly. So thank you again for being here, and now I will turn this over to Sarah and Whitney.
All right, great. Sorry, working on my unmute there. Let's get the next screen. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today and my colleague Sarah Kelly here. My name is Whitney Richardson. As Kristen said, I'm one of the curators at the Asheville Art Museum. Sarah is our curatorial fellow this spring. For me, one of my focuses at the museum is craft history. And Sarah is about to earn her master's degree from Warren Wilson College in the Critical Craft Studies program. So we're both really excited to talk with you today about craft in our collection. Our aim today is really to cover 4 points, or cover, I say that, but it's a huge topic, so we won't cover everything, but to look at the history of craft in Western North Carolina, how tourism played a part in its revival. We'll look at the what the craft revival was and how it created this idea of Appalachian craft. And finally, to look at the craft done in this region historically and today through the museum's collection. It's something that was and continues to be popular with tourists locally and nationally. All right, we've got our first slide here. Today we're discussing this intertwined history of craft and tourism in Asheville. So let's begin in the early days of Asheville. This image is taken from the courthouse that no longer exists in what we call today Pack Square. It's looking west on Patton Avenue, and it was taken in 1882. And relating to transportation, let's test out this Zoom group chat. Relating to transportation, what is it you see happening in Asheville at this time? Right, if you've been in Pack Square and you've looked down Patton Avenue, it's a familiar sight, but it looks a little different, right? At this point, we've got horse-drawn carts, someone is saying horse and carriage, right? And you'll also notice the streets. The streets aren't paved yet. We still have dirt roads at this point. So keep in mind, this was around 1882. Our next slide jumps only 8 years, and it's already changed quite a bit. Less than 10 years later, the city of Asheville has electric cars, and that came in 1890. paved, or at least cobblestone streets came by at that time, and there was a population boom, which meant more people living here as well as more tourists. In 1800, the population was 2,616 people, and by 1890, so 90 years later, it was 10,235 people. So within those 90 years, there was an increase of about 300%. This photo here is a historic one looking north on Broadway, also from Pack Square. So you can see the electric cars ran along the west side of Pack Square. All right, a big reason that we had such a boom in population. Oh, someone's already beat me to the punch. Influence of George Vanderbilt. Yes, one of the big reasons for this boom in population and tourism was because the train came to Asheville. And the train came to Asheville primarily for George Vanderbilt. The Southern Railway Passenger Depot, shown here in this old postcard, was built in 1896. It was built by Vanderbilt's architect for the Biltmore, Richard Morris Hunt, and it was really a train station for him to get to his home in the mountains, but quickly became an access point for other people to come and visit the city as well. All right, so if you have tourists, you need to find a place for them to stay. And the photo we see here is the newsstand of the Grove Park Inn, which was built in 1913. Sort of like a gift shop today, the newsstand was. Tourists wanted to bring home souvenirs with them. They were especially drawn to those things that were made with local materials. Clay from the earth used to make pottery, reeds from the rivers used to make baskets, rhododendron and mountain laurel twigs used to make furniture, textiles of local yarns, and you can see some of the evidence of those at the newsstand here at the Grove Park Inn. Let's see, I'm actually going to pause here for a moment. Kristen, I don't know if you want to welcome any newcomers and show them how to ask questions and participate.
Yes, thank you. So a few people have logged in since we started, so I just wanted to give a quick reminder about how to participate in this program, as Whitney said. So you really have two options. The first is to type any questions or comments you have into the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Whitney and Sarah will read these as we go, or when they get to a good stopping point, and I encourage you to enter your questions just as they occur to you. The second option is to use the raise hand button, which you'll find by clicking on participants at the bottom of your screen. And when there's time, I can call on anyone with a raised hand, unmute your audio, and you can ask a question. So that's it. It's pretty simple, but feel free to also send me a message if you have any questions as we go. I'm under Asheville Art Museum. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kristen. So stores quickly caught on to this idea of the gift shop at the hotels, and they started to market their, as you can see here in this brochure, handmade products of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This brochure here is from the Treasure Chest, which was a gift shop of sorts that you could get your souvenirs made locally from if you came to visit Asheville. You can see here there's a couple things I do want to point out. In the middle screen, the rhododendron souvenirs. At the bottom, there's a chair, and you're going to see a chair very much like that later on from the collection. And then, of course, on the right part is Pisgah Forest Pottery, which we'll also be looking at. The treasure chest was founded in 1924 by Hugh Brown. And then in 1933, he was joined by his brother Edwin Brown, along with William Lashley, to form the Three Mountaineers. Another store was the Spinning Wheel, shown here in this old advertisement for it. It was run by Clementine Douglas. It was founded in 1925, and she moved the shop to Hendersonville Road in 1939. She had Douglas Ellington, one of our city's famous architects who built the city building, add on to this old log cabin. Oh, sorry, I'm going to stop here. There's an echo or people talking in the background. If you don't have your microphone muted, make sure it is. All right. The spinning wheel. So she had Douglas Ellington add on to this old log cabin. Clementine Douglas was a major figure in the revival and promotion of mountain handicrafts. In the Asheville area, she employed many local women, spinning wheels, so it was all weaving. And she was one of the founders of the Southern Highland Craft Guild, at that point known as the Southern Highland Handicraft Guild. Now, does anyone recognize this building? If you travel south on Hendersonville Road, you pass it every time. It is still there. It's actually, today it's called Bella Hardware and Bath. It's a fixture store for your bathroom and kitchen sort of things. And I always smile when I drive by this building because I love thinking of its history. This one is not on Tunnel Road. I know the one you're thinking of, Marty's made a comment here. There is another Highland Craft Guild little sort of log cabin stand on Tunnel Road. This one's different. This one's on Hendersonville. All right. Besides shops that sold crafts to the tourists, there also began several schools at this time in the 1920s and 30s that helped to teach people how to make crafts. These skills offered people a way, especially during the Great Depression, to earn an extra income. Pennilyn weavers, or what today is the Pennilyn School of Craft, began in 1929 and was founded by Lucy Morgan. And this photo here, which is on view when we reopen the museum, you can see it hanging in the Peterson Gallery. This photo was taken by Baird Wooten. And it was she, along with another female photographer, Doris Ullman, that really documented the photography of this craft revival in the late 19th, early 20th century, and documenting the people that were part of it. Of course, their documentation has a little controversy. Looking back at it, they wonder how much photos were posed, how much they were actually capturing people doing what they would have been doing. So just wanted to mention that. It's an interesting history and could be its own presentation. But of course, they were taking photographs, and we use them a lot in telling this story. All right, next up, Warren Wilson College, another school that still teaches craft today, Warren Wilson College. What is Warren Wilson College today is the result of several schools merging. It began in 1894 as the Asheville Farm School, and then in 1942 merged with the Dorland Bell School to become Warren Wilson. And this image here you see is from the Dorland Bell School in the 1920s, teaching the women of that school how to weave. All right. Allen Stand Cottage Industries. This was founded by Francis Goodrich in 1897, and we see here a showroom interior shot. They had their first showroom in Asheville, which opened in 1907. And from here you can see in this showroom, it was a place for artists to sell their crafts of all kinds. We have textiles, pottery, baskets, rugs, so you can really see the sort of things that the crafters were making and that tourists were buying. Of course, in 1930, Francis Goodrich retired and Allen Stand Cottage Industries became known as the Southern Highland Handicraft Guild, later shortened to the Southern Highland Craft Guild. Having shops like these helped artists to sell their work to tourists who stopped in. But it was bigger organizations like the Guild that could really promote their members and offer marketing behind the craft to get their craft sold across the country, not just here locally. So looking at this catalog here as an example, this was in 1933. There was an exhibition put on that traveled around the country where they were displaying crafts, but they could also be purchased if you went to this exhibition. And it was sponsored by the American Federation of Arts, with stops in Washington, D.C., Brooklyn, New York, Decatur, Illinois, Omaha, Nebraska, St. Louis, Missouri, Scranton, Pennsylvania, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Brea, Kentucky. Someone's asking here, can you tell us more about the first ladies? Yes, a lot of the crafters in this catalog that we'll look at when we get to our collection were invited to the White House. Of course, this was during the Great Depression, the New Deal was happening, so a real effort to help fund makers and what they were doing and help them to make a living. And these three first ladies that you see that were sponsors of it, certainly part of that promotion of them. They, I know Roosevelt for sure did come to Asheville and visit some of the makers that we'll be looking at. Inside this booklet, so we just opened up that handicraft catalog, was this map. So when you went to the exhibition and you were looking at all the pieces, you could see where the craft was submitted from. And I love this detailed map of all the arrows pointing out from centrally located right where we are in Asheville and looking at the makers. And we're going to see a lot of the works mentioned on this map when we get to our collection and we look at some of the pieces in there. But with that little bit of background on the beginnings of tourism and craft production, I'm going to invite my colleague Sarah Kelly now to speak on Appalachian craft and what that term means.
Hi, everyone. So Whitney has done an awesome job setting us up and looking at some of the different industries and organizations that were in and around Asheville, sort of around the time of the turn of the century. And I just want to mention, I am not a trained historian. Whitney is, and she does an amazing job of that. My master's degree is in critical craft studies, and basically what that means is I'm trained to ask a lot of questions. I'm not trained to tell history. So that's what I'm going to do a little bit today, just to encourage us to think about alternative possibilities in the way that we look at our histories and the way that we talk about them. So before we start looking at some of the museum's holdings in craft, I want to take a minute to propose the idea of Appalachian craft as a social construct. What I mean by that is not that all of these crafts don't exist. Of course they do. We're going to look at them. But people living in the Appalachian Mountains have been making objects, whether for daily use, for entertainment, to trade and to barter, for economic supplement, for time immemorial, starting, of course, with the indigenous populations here, such as the Cherokee. But we have been culturally encouraged over time to think of Appalachian craft or craft that was made here in the mountains, maybe even exclusively in the mountains, by traditional means and in relative isolation, and maybe even solely for their own use and their families. So what if we step back for a minute and think about why people made what they made, how it was sold, to whom it was sold, and how the marketplace impacted what people were making. So yes, making things for your own household to use out of necessity was absolutely a part of rural life for many people living in Appalachia for many generations. And if we think about it, we're progressing just a little bit in history now, and we're looking at sort of past the turn of the century, getting into the 30s and the 40s. And we'll jump back and forth a little bit in time as we go forward and look at specific objects. But I want to think about the way Appalachian craft is construed sometimes. And we think about these things happening in isolation as sort of a looking back in time. But we already have trains, we have cable cars in Asheville. We have all of these technologies that are actually in the mountains at this time. So maybe people weren't really quite so isolated as we think of them sometimes. So Appalachian craft, when I say that, it's a construct. It's not because people living in Appalachia at and before this time never made anything. They certainly did, but they didn't make it in total isolation, as is sometimes promoted through local color writing and early guild marketing and some of these other industries that were trying to attract tourists or selling to tourists from outside of the area. And if you haven't heard the term local color writing, it's basically like a an early travel blog. A lot of times people would travel, they would write about their experiences, what they saw, what they visited, where they were staying, and these things would be published back in their hometowns, maybe the big cities in the Northeast or wherever they were coming from. And then also during this time, a lot of crafters were hired by local industries, or they were paid piecemeal, piece for piece, for the objects that they were making. And a lot of times they were encouraged to make works that were designed specifically for urban middle-class consumers, such as the tourists that were coming to town, or even those maybe who were receiving mail order catalogs from a distance. So they were not always making things for their own use, or they may have been making things for their own use, but it might not have been the same things that were being sold as tourist craft. So I want to look at author Jane Becker, who I love, and it's a little bit controversial. Not everyone loves her as much as I do, so I do want to keep that in mind. You do not have to agree with me by any means. But Jane Becker talks about the way that in the first half of the 20th century, most of the work made and sold through the guilds for economic interest was designed by the founders and the teachers that were coming to the area, who were often white middle-class women who were educated outside of the region at the big universities. They might have been educated in education, so in teaching, in craft, in home economics, or through social work. And I want to read actually a little quote for you from Jane Becker. And this is a book called Selling Tradition. If you're interested in this kind of thing, I highly recommend it. Which is about the traditionalization and commodification of craft in Appalachia, specifically in the 1930s and 1940s. So this book specifically talks about that decade and not necessarily outside of it. And this is at a time when the nation was really searching for a national identity. They're kind of recovering from First World War, the Depression, and they're really looking for sort of a value set to sort of bring them out of a hard time. So I'm going to read this quote. Reflecting back on her years as a weaving teacher and founder of the Weavers Guild at the Pi Beta Phi Settlement School in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, Winnie Jean Redding noted that she had taught mountain women to weave in their homes, but had herself designed the pieces they made. This was necessary, she felt, because the mountain women had no background of how other people lived and how what they made in their homes could be used in somebody else's home. It was, she explained, a question of bringing back ideas from the outside world to be interpreted by their skill. Thus, Redding and her colleagues in similar mountain craft enterprises called on Appalachian craftspeople to use their skills to interpret not their own values and customs, but the culture of others, specifically the culture of urban middle-class Americans. To assist the mountaineers in this project, craft leaders in 1929 established the Southern Highland Craft Guild, a loose federation of craft producing centers and schools. And my reasoning, I want to repeat this. My job is to ask questions. That's what I'm trained to do. And my reason for sharing this with you is not at all to imply that this is either good or bad, that the teachers and social workers who encouraged craft production at this time as an economic tool were right or wrong. And I just want to, I'll come in a bit later. We're going to turn it back to Whitney, and I'll come in a bit later and talk about some contemporary institutions and some contemporary makers who are still kind of, who are working in sort of a tourist environment where either they're long-term members of the Southern Highland Craft Guild, they're part of studio tours and things like that that happen in the region. And I just want to sort of also acknowledge that the leaders at this time, the teachers who were coming from the Northeast, they really set this region on a path to an amazingly supportive and nourishing region for makers to live and work and make a living the way that they do today. But I also think it's important to recognize sort of the social and political impacts of how we talk about craft in the region, that we don't simply romanticize the past and speak to this at any point as if it were ever one homogeneous region without social class, without race, without those kinds of things at this time as well. And Whitney, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And with that, I'm going to go into Handicrafts of the Southern Highlands from 1937 by Alan Eaton. When this book was published, he, the author, and this book really became one of the guiding forces for an interest in what has become called Appalachian craft, whether rightly or wrongly, as Sarah mentioned, and as defined by Eaton in this case, of what he called handicrafts of the Southern Highlands. In 1920, he became an associate director at the Russell Sage Foundation in New York City. And that's a philanthropic foundation that works to improve people's lives socially, economically, for areas that they feel are underrepresented. And in this case, it brought him to Western North Carolina. He came to the John C. Campbell Folk School, another school that we'll talk about in today's presentation, for the annual Conference of Southern Mountain Workers. And by 1926, he had returned again and again and spoke at the conference addressing what he called mountain handicrafts, what they mean to our home life and to the life of our country. He really pushed forward this idea of William Morris from the English arts and crafts movement, that there was a dignity in a craft being made from start to finish by a single artist, often out of native local materials, and as a sort of rebellion against the Industrial Revolution. But of course, when William Morris was saying this in 1870, it was early days of Industrial Revolution. In almost 1940, when Alan Eaton was saying it, we were well underway as an industrial nation. He also helped to promote this idea that people from the mountains had left their rural homes during the Industrial Revolution for better jobs. And as such, much of the mountain crafts were going to be lost. This was something that Francis Goodrich of Allen Stand and Southern Highland Craft Guild was also really interested in and concerned about, and wanted to preserve things that people had made. But the fact was, crafts sold, right? We were looking at stores earlier. It sold to tourists, it sold to buyers at craft fairs around the country. And when those marketing the goods saw what sold, they adjusted their inventory to match. In 1937, his book came out, and it's truly a survey of the region's crafts that presented it as part of rural heritage of America. Oh, and I also want to point out photographs for it were taken by Doris Ullman. Here we have an image of Alan Eaton and the artist Granny Donaldson, Kate Donaldson, known as Granny. He went around the region with Doris Ullman researching for this book for many years before it was published. Here we have a photograph of Granny Donaldson making one of her cow blankets. You can see in the box by her feet, she's got all these crocheted forms of animals and people and trees, and then she would sort of lay them out and applique them to this cotton base. So popular, in fact, when the John C. Campbell School also had a craft fair held in New Jersey, right, not here locally, in the 1930s. They used an image not made by her, but certainly inspired by Granny Donaldson's cow blankets as the cover. It describes the purpose, this exhibition and the booklet you see here on your screen. It describes the purpose of the folk school and how the practice of traditional handicrafts provided financial support, as well as a means of unifying the community. This cover illustration is by June Coolidge Carey. She was the niece of Olive Dame Campbell, who was the founder of the John C. Campbell School. And the event was organized by the head of the handicraft department at the folk school in New Jersey. Pittman, just like Sarah had mentioned, was educated at Columbia University. She came from New Jersey, so she knew that area, and was really part of this idea of making connections outside of the Appalachian region to market folk school crafts nationwide. And here we have finally made it to our collection. Here is our Granny Donaldson blanket, cow blanket from 1936. Granny Donaldson was actually a cook in the kitchen at the John C. Campbell School and originally made these blankets. They're cow blankets. She was making them for her cows to help keep them warm in the winter. And, oh, and someone just asked, why cow blankets as their name? It's exactly it. They were used to, as a fun craft to make and keep your cows warm when they needed help keeping warm. And someone at the school said, you know, those are really great. I think you should consider selling them. She did, and the rest is history. We have one in our collection now. Let's see, someone has commented here. Could one say in this decade, the 1930s, when handicrafts became less about function and more about art? That's a great question. I don't think so. I think craft as decoration is has a very long history. If you look back to within our collection, Tiffany glass and Newcomb vases, those were all meant as decoration and made much earlier than the 30s. But there's always this play between function and decoration and craft. And I think one of the things I like most about it is there's a constant conversation happening there. Was this one in the collection ever used for a cow? Someone asked. I don't know. It depends. I guess it's from 1936. It's an early one, so entirely possible. But you have to think at some point when she realized she could make them and sell them as a work of art, they probably didn't end up on a cow. Another one from our collection, a woman named Mae Richie Deschamps. She made this corn husk doll along with the one that you saw on our opening screen. And she lived in Swannanoa, so close by. And she came from a long line of corn husk doll makers in her family. And over time, they really developed some amazing techniques on how to wrap the corn husk so tightly and how to make such beautiful forms. Someone commented, the colors are so bright, talking about the Granny Donaldson blanket. And I'm glad you said that because it's one of my interests I've read lately. There's some scholarship that always assumed Granny Donaldson was using natural dyes for her fabrics. It just makes sense if she's out on her land that she would use things she found there to dye it. But the fact that the colors have remained fairly universally in her blankets so bright leans us towards the belief that perhaps she was using synthetic dyes, which is really interesting. Someone said, what is the figure next to the camel? And why a camel on a cow blanket? If you can identify any of these animals, you win. I think some of them are a little difficult to define. This was her chance to outlet her creativity. We go into pottery. Omar Khayyam pottery was in the Candler area from 1911 to 1935. Oscar Lewis Batchelder ran the pottery until his death in 1935. And we have a photograph here. We have a photograph here taken of Batchelder again by Doris Ullman in 1934, so just a year before his death. And my colleague Hillary is here today. Hello, Hillary. She reminds me there is an I Spy activity on our website using the cow blanket. This is going to be the highlight of this talk today. Go check out more on the cow blanket on our website. All right, Batchelder. In his glazes, he was experimenting with things that were popular in the rest of the country happening with art pottery, and he used a glossy black Albany slip like you can see here, something that places that were more nationally known like Rookwood were doing. So if you came to the area and saw this piece locally made, it was certainly in fashion at the time to purchase. His pottery, his art pottery, received national attention in 1919 when it received a medal from the Applied Arts exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago. So again, to Sarah's point that she made earlier, it wasn't an isolated area. We had artists traveling back and forth, entering competitions at the Art Institute of Chicago, and in this case, winning. Someone asked why the name Omar Khayyam, and I'm going to go back to this slide. Named after the poet, and it was just this romantic idea that this potter could live and create pottery. And you'll notice even the way Batchelder dresses in these long kind of flowing robes, he really is embracing this idea of the poet potter. Oh, and go back, sorry about that. This piece here, the picture from 1920, is also on view. This next piece here, not on view, but it has a more iridescent finish. And if you join me a couple weeks back when we were looking at glass, we talked about an iridescent finish that Tiffany Studios was doing. So very popular throughout the country. And here he is trying to capture that same aesthetic in pottery. When Batchelder died in 1935, the pottery changed hands, and for several years was actually operated as Throckmorton Pottery. Another pottery in the region was Nankana. It began in Tennessee with Walter B. Stephen here as a little boy and his mother Nellie Randall Stephen. This photo was taken in 1882 of the two of them when they were in Tennessee. So the first Nankana, there were two, from 1904 to 1910 was when Walter and his mother Nellie were working together in Tennessee. And the arrowheads painted here that you see on this pot, this is porcelain slip, so liquid porcelain painted onto the pottery. Similar to Wedgwood, right? You think of Wedgwood pottery, and it's thought that Nellie would have been introduced to Wedgwood pottery at the 1904 St. Louis Fair. So she was a very talented artist. She saw something and thought to herself, I could recreate that, and did. Set out, worked with her son to create this, and sold them very successfully. In this one, you can really see what a great artist Nellie was. Walter would have been the one throwing the pots, creating the shapes, perhaps even doing the glazing, but the top work, the painting with the porcelain slip was really Nellie's specialty. Another example here of her painting flowers on this picture are just lovely. All right. Now, after Nellie's death, around 1910, 1911, I believe, Walter moved to North Carolina, and he continued Nankana pottery here from 1913 to 1916. And you can see he's also trying to continue this porcelain slip look. In this case, it's a cameo sort of look to it. And this was something that when Wedgwood did it, they were applying it out of a mold. And Nellie had taught her son, Walter, how to do it by hand. And so here is one of his early attempts at painting this on 1914 on this cup. Now, what do you think this cup was used for if it's got that sort of decoration on it? This is one of the things that going back to that function versus decoration, that I love about craft and decorative arts. Exactly, everyone's saying wine. It has grapes on it. This glass was definitely meant for wine. All right, in this one, I'll still Nankana here in North Carolina. This piece really shows off from the collection Walter B. Stevens' work with the natural clay. He was using clay from the area and experimenting with it to see what sort of textures and colors he could get. And here, now this is very reminiscent of that dark picture that we saw by Batchelder. Batchelder was a mentor to Walter B. Stevens when he first moved to North Carolina. So you'll certainly see a similarity between their work as you kind of look through it. This candlestick here was made sometime between 1913 and 1916 for Nankana and has that same dark glaze. Yes, it is a candle. Right. Let's see, now we're on to Pisgah Forest pottery. We saw that earlier for sale at the treasure chest. This photo, also taken by Doris Allman, is of Walter B. Stevens as an older gentleman working on some of his pottery. During his time working under the name Pisgah Forest Pottery, he actually became the first pottery member of the Southern Highland Craft Guild. He had previously sold his work as well at Allenstown Cottage Industries, so he had a long history with Francis Goodrich, as well as continuing forward with the guild. Oh, someone asked, is Robert Brunk from the local auction house? Yeah, we have this piece here was a gift of Mr. Brunk in 2004. Yes. All right, another great piece of Pisgah Forest pottery. Still working on the cameo look with that painted porcelain slip like his mother had taught him. But here he's really taken his own spin on the subject matter. I'm sure he was having fun with it. I also think maybe it was to help sell to tourists. You wanted something that had that sort of mountains look to it. And in this one, you can also see his signature pink glaze that he almost always used on the inside of his pieces. And I've heard a lot of scholars refer to it as a reference to the land of the sky sunsets, which I think is a really romantic and lovely idea. Still with Pisgah Forest pottery, this piece is trying out some new glazing techniques, certainly with what was in line with what was popular throughout the country in art pottery. And it's small, it's a 7-inch piece, right? So as a tourist, it's something that you can easily bring back with you. We have a question here. Is art pottery, as opposed to simply pottery, the proper term for all of these artistic stoneware, clay, porcelain crafts? Yeah, if I go back and forth on the term, I don't do it to be confusing for sure. Art pottery really came about as this idea that it's still possibly functional. You might be buying a vase or a pitcher, but it was this beautiful piece that you wanted to have in your home. So this idea of art pottery was pottery crossing the line into art, and this idea of craft, what is craft and what is art, and isn't it all the same? This piece here on the screen really shows Stephen's foray into playing with glazes and experimenting, and he figured out how to do this beautiful crystalline glaze. Something again that was nationally popular, Fulper Pottery was doing it, and he figured out here how to do it on his own, and it sold well for him. All right, moving on out of clay. This is Biltmore Industries, founded in 1901 with the financial backing of George and Edith Vanderbilt. It was in Biltmore Village, and it taught people in the area who wanted to learn the skills of weaving and wood carving as a way to earn extra money. The teachers were Charlotte Yale, who was a weaver, and Eleanor Vance, who was a carver. And they were very successful. It began in 1901. They had the backing of one of the wealthiest families in the country, but by 1909, they were self-sustaining and making a profit. Pardon me. In 1904, Yale and Vance felt that they were no longer needed with Biltmore Estate Industries and left. It was bought by Fred Seeley, the manager of the Grove Park Inn that we looked at a photo of earlier, and it was moved to what we call Grovewood Village today. It became Biltmore Industries minus the estate part. And while they tended to focus more on textiles that we see here, they would create textiles used for men's suits, for women's clothing, blankets, towels, all that sort of thing. They were certainly also still doing a little bit of carving, at least at the beginning. And here we have a great piece from the collection, hearth bellows, so intricately carved. You can really tell the influence of the Vanderbilts if people locally were, welcomed into their home to see the sort of English furniture that they had as inspiration. You can see it right here on this hearth bellows. And let's see, someone here says, Homespun Industries. Yes, there's a Homespun museum, eventually when they only did weaving, and it's a good museum. She recommends going. That's great. So when Yale and Vance left Biltmore Industries, they moved to Tryon to create Tryon toy makers and wood carvers. And just as Biltmore Industries moved more into textiles, Tryon toy makers and wood carvers really moved into wood. They carved wood like we see here. These two, one of them I believe is on view, not both of them, bookends. Here we have the Goldilocks and the Three Bears from the Tryon toy makers. And something really interesting here, it's not an Appalachian style. This was something that Yale and Vance had seen when they traveled around Europe and really gave a lot of their toys a much more German style. All right, carving, we have Brasstown Carvers. They also sold their works through the Southern Highland Craft Guild and were featured in Alan Eaton's Handicrafts of the Southern Highlands book and gained much notoriety because of both of those publications and marketing tools for them. And we know a lot of the artists had favorite forms. One of Ben Hall's was the dog. He created many different dogs. Here we have Glenn Brown's goose. Both of those are on view. And we can welcome everyone back into the museum. Of course, there were also Cherokee carvers. And one of the most famous, well-known, is Amanda Crowe. Here she is in 1953, demonstrating wood carving. And this was really a big part of her life. She was born on the Qualla Boundary. She left to go to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to study formal sculpture and came back to Cherokee to teach the next generations of Cherokee carvers. One of her most famous forms are bears. Basketry as well. One of the greats of Cherokee basket makers was Romina Bradley, pictured here. This basket on display. Only Cherokee basket weavers used river cane. Of course, there were also white women who were weaving baskets, and they would often use white oak, something that the Cherokee weavers would use as well, but the river cane was really specific to the Cherokee early on. This double weave basket by Romina Bradley is a very complex weave and really shows the excellent skill she had for this. Finally, Ava Wolf here, a purse basket. You can really see highlighted here, she would use natural dyes, as many of these weavers would, to dye the river cane and highlight the Cherokee symbolic weaving as seen in this basket. Rustic furniture. Here we have an example of one of these roadside stands, John Hensel seated out in front of Laurel Den. And something tourists have in common with a museum is you don't really have room to store a full piece of furniture. So a lot of the miniatures became very popular. And this chair is what I referenced early on. The Laurel Den, you know, Karen is asking a question here. I don't know where that still exists. I'm not sure where it is. You see the miniature chair here that I mentioned when we looked at the treasure chest brochure. It looks just like it, something you could buy at one of these roadside stands and actually have the artist carve the name of the city or your name into the back of it. Yeah, they've got a great collection of rhododendron chairs at the Mars Hill College Museum. Thank you for reminding me of that one. Rustic furniture here again. This is created with the twisty mountain laurel twigs and rhododendron twigs. One of the famous known artists, and it took a long time for him to be known, was Charles Dobbins. He carved or burnt blowing rock artists into everything. So there's been research done to go back and identify who this artist was. He would make these sort of extravagant lamp, pencil stand, magazine rack, cigarette holder stands that were really unique and special pieces for tourists to bring back. And then finally for me, we're going to look at some silver. In Asheville, historically, that was primarily William Waldo Dodge. He was also a member of the Southern Highland Craft Guild, and very much embraced this romantic idea of the craftsman from the arts and crafts era. This is inside his Dodge Silver shop in Biltmore Forest around 1928. You can see him here. He's the one in the white shirt without the vest, working on the silver. And pieces from our collection. His work is all hand hammered and finished. The wood would have been hand carved for the pieces. This one you see here has the floral handle, which was unique to him. And then these on view are cocktail shaker and cocktail cups. Next to our Zelda Fitzgerald painting, have a lovely home on view at the moment. We look at craft historically, very specifically in the first 3 galleries of the collection hall, but where craft and art have really become one is as you go further along in the contemporary galleries. A lot of what people from the Appalachian Mountains were selling historically in the early 20th century played up this love of the simplicity at the time. But a lot of what they were doing was very complex work and showed off some strong skills. And Sarah is going to have a look at our contemporary craft that follows in this tradition. Sarah?
Great. And I want to be cognizant of everyone's time, so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes here at the end and just show you a few things that are happening in the region currently. So I want to focus on 2 organizations that I think do a really great job, and then we'll wrap up with another Native artist in the area. So I want to talk just for a minute about the Southern Highland Craft Guild and some of its current members. Everyone that we're going to look at is not necessarily a member right at this moment, but maybe they have been at some point over the last several decades and have been really influential in the region. We'll also then talk a little bit about the Toe River Studio Tour, which I think is really cool and a great way that artists in the region have come together and to kind of continue on attracting outside audiences to the area and supporting one another in their sales. Whitney, if you'll change the slide. So we'll start with William Bernstein, who has been in the area for quite a while. Was a resident artist at Pennilyn School of Craft from 1968 to 1970, and was also one of the founding members of the Glass Art Society, which started with just Mark Pizer, Fritz Dreisbach, and Bernstein, and has now gone on to become an international organization that still gets together and has a big conference and everything. And I think they meet in Asheville pretty regularly as well. His son, Alex, is also a glass artist and who has work on view in our atrium at the moment. So when you come back in, you'll have to check that out. Next is Robert Levin, who lives in the Burnsville area and was also a resident artist at Pennilyn. He was there from 1976 to 1980. And he says the goblet is a form he's returned to throughout his career. This form offers really sort of endless possibilities and opportunity to push and expand boundaries of form and function. So the sort of art craft thing has come up before, and it's like, yeah, technically this is a functional piece. Would you use it functionally? Maybe you would. I guess it depends on why you buy it. I probably would. But so, you know, kind of looking at some of these artists who are sort of pushing some of those boundaries, that's really awesome. Next is Jim Parmentier, who works in collaboration with his wife, Cheryl. They're longtime members of the Guild. They raised their children in New York before moving to the area, and they've been studio potters since the 1970s, and are really appreciated for their collaborative work, working together in the studio and kind of passing things back and forth between the two of them. And they mostly work by hand building or working from slabs of clay flat rather than throwing things on the wheel. Next is Michael Cheryl, and I just, out of curiosity, want to know if anyone has seen the retrospective, and if you have, I'm really jealous. I think it's now, it started in Charlotte at the Mint Museum, went to the Renwick, and is now in Arizona State, and believe me, I'm really thinking about flying out there just to see it. So he grew up actually in the Charlotte area, and really cites some amazing mentors in the area. However, is primarily self-taught and really has done a lot of experimenting on his own throughout his career, and continues to do so today. And he was really, in the retrospective catalog, even though I didn't see the exhibition, he really talks about how Southern Highland Craft Guild was really foundational in helping him get a start in his career. Next, Billy Ruth Sedith. Is an amazing basket maker, and I found this really interesting. I didn't know this. She actually had a first career as a school psychologist, and she really actually cites that first career as really inspirational to her work. She talks about sort of the testing and the statistics and things that she had to utilize in that first career as a psychologist to actually inspire some of the mathematical things she does with her baskets. Next, Rodney Leftwich began making pottery in his, and he is from Western North Carolina originally. And actually, what I thought is interesting about him is we've seen some of the pottery with the cameos and things that we looked at with Whitney, and Leftwich is another potter in the area that has done some of this work, but he has sort of multiple lines of work that he does. And what we're seeing here is pottery that's been incised and kind of carved out. And there's a lot of sort of storytelling and narrative component to some of these pieces. Next is Michael Rotowski, who actually also works with his partner and has a collaborative pottery that they do a lot of work together and go to shows together, things like that. Next, Kathy Triplett. Her work is often highly sculptural at its core, and a lot of times references creatures and nature, or relationships between nature and technologies of human creation. I think it's really interesting. She cites being inspired by like early primitive tools and things like that in her work, and often also does sort of mixed media and assemblage in her work in addition to the ceramic. Gehry Beecham is another glass artist in the area. He actually came to the area to work with Harvey Littleton in his studio when Littleton was first getting his studio set up in the area. Beecham actually learned with Harvey Littleton in Wisconsin at the school where Littleton was teaching there. And he went on to have a short career in a sort of a factory setting, and just really did not like it, and was talking to Littleton, and Littleton said, you know, come on down and I'll give you a job for a few years. So he worked with Littleton for about 5 years before setting up his own studio in the area. And then I want to take a quick look at this map. This is really cool from the Tow River art website, and it's an interactive map that you'll have to check out. It tells you where different studios are, different artists in the area, places you can eat, and all that kind of stuff. It's really fun and interactive, and a great way to sort of bring makers of the area together and help sort of cross promote each other. So the artists that we're looking at now, the next couple, are part of this Tow River Arts organization. This is Yaffa Todd, who I didn't know this. I found this out when researching for this. She was one of the first female teachers in glass at Pennilyn in the 1970s. I think she was the second one to teach in glass there, the second woman, which I thought was great. We have Littleton and Pizer and Richard Ritter at that time. So this woman coming in really just a bit later than them and saying, hey, I'm here too. And I think that's really great. Terry also a resident artist at Pennilyn, and we're seeing that with a lot of these folks who have decided to settle in the region, whether they're from here or whether they moved here for various reasons. Many of them have been at Pennilyn either and spent extensive time there as resident artists or just taken lots of workshops or taught there and that kind of thing. Sean Ireland was another resident artist at Pennilyn who settled in the area. And actually, I think his studio now is actually on that Pennilyn Road. It's really close by. And he has actually spent a lot of time as well back and forth between Italy, teaching with the University of Georgia program in Cortona, and really cites his time in Italy as inspiration to his work, and uses lots of natural materials and hand harvests and processes his own clay materials. Kenny Piper is another, let's see, yeah, so he grew up in the area and actually took classes, I think when he was in high school, with Cynthia Bringle and Norm Schulman. So he was first interested in clay and then kind of got converted over to glass when he took a class with Richard Ritter. He spent over a decade in the Bay Area in San Francisco as he was learning and getting his career going, and then decided to come back to the region. Heather Haitala is a textile artist, but also works in many different media. She works in ceramics and wood, and sometimes combines a lot of these elements in her work. And last but certainly not least, we'll wrap up with another example of native art in the area. This is a Betty Maney basket, and this is a teeny tiny little miniature basket. And if any of you visited when Appalachia Now was up, you may have seen this piece. It was in the upstairs gallery on the top level. And she's using white oak here. Some of her other ones are featuring, just as Whitney was saying before, in some of the more historic pieces, a lot of walnut, bloodroot dyes, natural dyes from the area. And I think that'll wrap it up. I know that we're getting to our time here, and thank you all so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much, Whitney and Sarah. I'm sure you guys could talk about this topic for hours, but it is 1:30, a little after, so we want to be respectful of your time. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If you do have more questions, please feel free to email us, and we will try to get those answered for you. And as a reminder, I'll send out a program evaluation in a little bit to collect your feedback. We're scheduling these kinds of member programs every week until we reopen, so please be sure to be on a lookout for your email on Mondays. And I hope to see you all again next week. Thank you again. Stay safe and healthy, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, thank you.